Okay, we're up to alleged errors of moral repugnance, and in many ways, this is going to be the easiest of the categories because, as we're going to see on the board here, there are two whopping philosophical problems that are not cleared by these objections. The first one has to do with the problem of evil, and the second one is going to have to do with this just a little bit of knowledge of history and Christian influence. But let's look at the problem of evil issue first, and this is really one of those arenas that we are going to agree wholeheartedly with the presuppositionalist and say, by what standard? And we're going to explain what we mean by that, because it's a powerful argument. The problem of saying evil, if we can show that it's incoherent in general, when it moves inside a book, and that's literally what's happening here, as the person that does not believe that there is a transcendent good and lawgiver is now coming in with his red pen and just starting to write all over here, but wait just a minute, because if what's really incoherent is the problem of evil here, and it's why I call it the problem of saying evil, because we can and the skeptic can't. The problem of evil is actually a devastating problem for atheism and one of the most powerful demonstrations of the truth of the Christian faith. And until we realize why that is, we're going to be in trouble because it's one of the most frequent objections that's brought up. So, here's what's the problem, right, in a nutshell, logically. The problem of saying evil is this. And you can look at the classical logical problem, whether it's Lucretius in the ancient world or whether it's David Hume in the modern world, and it basically cashes out in this way. You have several attributes of God, and then you have this attribute in the world, which of course is evil. The idea is that they don't logically cohere. And what that means is that they necessarily cannot coexist. That's what it means. When you have a logical contradiction, the two things don't go together. They negate each other. And so in this case, you have good, you have God's power, and you have God's knowledge or wisdom, and I'll put that in parentheses as a species of knowledge. What that would cash out to is an omniscient being, an omnipotent being, an omnibenevolent being, would, could, and all that stuff. Okay, so that's what logic is saying. Here, the coexistence of these divine attributes with evil in the world is said to contradict. Now, consider. If it is logically impossible that good and evil could coexist at all in any possible world in any sense, then either good or evil would not exist. Following so far. Let's play that out. If evil does not exist at all, well, then there's no problem of evil, is there? That's pretty anticlimactic. If, on the other hand, what is meant is that good does not exist, well, that creates a problem too, because if good does not exist, then there's no standard by which to call something evil so that evil once again falls the other way. It's one of those choose your poison kind of problems. And consequently, the thesis that good and evil cannot coexist per se is logically incoherent. Now, better philosophers in the 20th century have looked back on that, whether it's in Hume's dialogues or in other subsequent papers, and they said, you know, that doesn't work out. Let's transfer this to what's called now the evidential problem of evil. The problem, though, is that the evidential problem of evil is nothing of the sort. They simply smuggle the logical problem back in under the sentiment of really horrific examples, whether it's animal suffering or what really gets us is serious problems of children being abused or something else. And let me say up front that there is a problem of evil, but it's a pastoral problem. It's an existential problem. It's not a philosophical problem. Where it is a philosophical problem, it's a problem for the atheist. And now we'll see why when we move it over to evidence. Because here's what they're really saying. If a God of those attributes exists, well then surely he must eliminate evil in X unit of time or degree or kind. In reality, this is just moving things off a few paces so that we don't so quickly remember that logical problem of evil. However, if it is impossible to say that good and evil cannot coexist without running into an instant contradiction, the same contradiction does not suddenly go away because we've made it less instant. And so usually the evidential problem will morph itself into, but what morally sufficient reason would he have? Because he knows enough about the Christian answer to say, but yeah, but I don't see how he can bring good out of this. I don't see any good reason, any morally sufficient reason. And that's usually what's meant by evidence. They'll say, what morally sufficient reason could God have for ordaining X instance of suffering, frequency, maybe the scope of suffering, the intensity, or the senselessness of, and there's a loaded word because its sense really begs the question, right back to that morally sufficient reason. What greater good could possibly come out of X? It's a great question, but it belongs to what we call theodicy proper. Theodicy, no longer the problem of evil proper, but now an explanation or a justification of the ways of God. What is God doing with suffering? It's really a different department. And so the question, what reason, is really a disguised, there is no morally sufficient reason. But notice just for a moment what we would need to know in order to know the reason. We'll need to know 4 things, at least. We'll need to know, number 1, the whole set of all reasons which could possibly justify all possible instances of evil. And of course, as a subset, that would have to include the actual instances of evil, which are at least possible. Secondly, you need to know all possible outcomes of those means. And then, of course, thirdly, all actual outcomes which such a being that's under investigation indeed does value in order to judge him. And then, by what will you judge him? Well, fourthly, you'll need that self-sufficient, eternal, and immutable moral criteria for the judgment of all 3 of those previous things. You'll need necessity, self-sufficiency, eternality, infinity, immutability, and you'll need omniscience to do all this thinking. Pretty anticlimactic. See, that's the problem with all of what's called atheology, or logical arguments for the non-existence of God. You kind of need God to exist in order to say that X divine attribute would or could do fill in the predicate. But here's the problem with that. If it's a logical argument against God, your problem is much greater than the fact that that divine attribute, according to your argument, has never existed and so forth. No. It could never exist. Not just so, never so happened to exist. If the logical argument against God succeeds, that attribute is a contradiction in terms, could never exist. How then can you predicate of a square circle or a married bachelor or anything else? You can't. And so, in order to show that God doesn't exist, God has to exist. And that's a problem. But that's apologetics for another day. But we see that if that's true, and you move that same problem inside the book, what do you have? You have no need to go into these, do you? And it's just like this. If there's no such thing as married bachelors, because there cannot be a married bachelor, I don't have to bug any census workers. I don't have to hire anybody to send out census workers out to the community to find that elusive married bachelor. I'll never find one. I don't have to waste any graph paper at all trying to draw the square circle. Can't be done. So the problem is going to move indoors into this book, but not to humor, but to come down and to help. And one thing you don't want to do is follow the skeptic around in the exegetical sands. And we'll see that in the next few weeks, not because there's all these problems, but because there's no lack of imagination in the skeptic or in ourselves to come up with any number of Bible difficulties that you could twist and turn and read in a certain way to say something that would be false if my premises are not the Bible's premises. But these objections come, and it is helpful to know how to apply this issue. One more piece of the puzzle, though, because I said there's 2 basic big picture things that are not seen. We live in the suburbs, we live in Disneyland. And one of the problems is we don't know our history. And we don't know bloody history, because history was bloody. What we do is we stand over here from the vantage point and the platform of Christian morality. In other words, we have a morality, we've inherited a morality, even Richard Dawkins has. We've inherited a morality from inside this book. We then use that to look back on all those barbarians and to criticize as if above this book, criticizing back into this book. Trouble is, this book is reporting the facts of this fallen world. You see what we're doing? It's a big optical illusion, and all because we don't know our history. And so all these different things are falling out in that way. And so moral objection number 1, the Mosaic Law, that was barbaric, that was primitive. It was so draconian, all the punishments and things like that. Well, just a couple things. Not only can the skeptic not argue against it, but we've got some pretty good rationale that explains it. You may not like it, but for within the Bible storyline, it makes sense. Hebrews 7:12 talks about a change in the law because there's a change in the priesthood. A lot of these objections are really just ceremonial law playing out. They're things that don't have any, or don't have that same application. In other words, the audience and the letter of the law is different because it was fulfilled in Christ. And a lot of that is what's going on. Every punishment in the Mosaic administration is a relaxation from the original death penalty. What am I talking about? Over here, Genesis 2:16 and 17, on the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. He did die that day. He died spiritually when they tasted of the fruit. But Adam and Eve lived on, and so did everybody else. And so what's been happening is that God has been graciously, kindly making the sun come up every single morning. When in fact, the original deal was single disobedience, death. Find a law in the Mosaic law. Any law, it doesn't matter. Oh, there's this terrible law. No, it isn't. It's kinder than the original. It's kinder than the original. Keep that under your hat when we get to the genocide objection as well. It'll be important. So the kindness of God, not only in relaxing the penalty, but mediation through a priesthood. Everywhere in the Pentateuch you look at Nadab and Abihu. Oh, that's so mean. God just lashed out against them for this thing you have no idea what it is. And so we're just talking smoke at that point. But God gives his reason in Leviticus 10:3 and 4 of why Aaron was to keep his peace, because God will be sanctified among those who draw near to him. You see, they were the priesthood that were responsible for showing forth God to the nations. And so God kindly set up cones, flares, police tape everywhere in the Pentateuch. All those laws, that's what those are. Those are kindly keeping you and me away from the cliff through the priesthood and the tour guides of the priests of Israel. Think of it that way. There's other things that will help there too, but let's just get on. Moral objection number 2, and I have this out of order on the board, but the Bible's God commands genocide. Now remember that original wrath, that original sin warranted the full extent of God's punishment, and that implied all subsequent death and pain, like all subsequent punishments for particular laws. You say, well, what punishments? Well, you can't separate culture from religion. Let's say it this way. If you're for the Allied powers coming into Germany and liberating those death camps, if you're for the Union armies coming in and liberating the plantations in the South, pick your historical example, then you should be for the armies of Israel marching into Canaan and liberating those women and children. Now, half those things, that won't work. Interesting way to resolve it. The Yale philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff is one that would say, well, if you look at Judges, Joshua and those books, there's sort of a literary unit. And what's happening here is something Wolterstorff called hagiographic hyperbole. Yeah. And so if you think of biblical characters like Joseph, Daniel, Mary especially, that you know they're sinners, but Roman Catholics don't know that, but you know they're sinners. And yet the Bible depicts them in such a way that their sins are they're made into this virtuous people, and those sins are not recorded really for the most part. And what Wolterstorff's saying is the same thing's happening with Joshua. And so you see in 1 Samuel, later on in 1 Samuel, David is still whooping up on the Amalekites, and you're thinking to yourself, what Amalekites? I thought they wiped them all out. They were supposed to devote them to destruction. Remember the Haram. That means devoted to destruction, not just gold, not just those things, people, women and children. Now, Wolterstorff's argument is harder to make about Joshua 6 through 12, because there you have the formulation in the words men and women and so forth. And so it's a bit tougher to say both man and woman, young and old. Now, could you say, well, maybe that's a merism. A merism is a Hebrew literary device, kind of poetic. It's used in Deuteronomy 6, Genesis 1, throughout the Psalms, day and night. Whenever you rise, walk by the way, whenever you lie in your bed, at your gates, at your door. What's happening in all those? Well, in this device called a merism, you have a statement of two pairs that are meant to express a totality. Basically cashes out to mean all the time, in every place, in all of life, and so forth. Could that be what is happening, and that in all of the cases, it wasn't really men, women, and children? I think that's a stretch of an argument. Obviously, the most straightforward way to read it is that half of those times in Deuteronomy, you see the context, and it wasn't to be all of them, that they were to be taken as spoils, which that was liberation. That part of the argument works. But even if even if every single case was wiping out those people, then that would be just. Given these premises, the people to blame are those people that are treating their women and their children and their generations that way. And again, I would say that in the biblical covenantal flow of history, this really is, and this is not special pleading, this is our view of the law fulfilled in Christ. It really was a special circumstance for the armies of Israel in Canaan. It is not any kind of prescription for that to happen in secular states or theocratic states today, because that was a special circumstance. Moving on to the next issue, and that is racism and slavery. Racial unity and division in the Bible in general. Let's just look at this ABC's 101 level. First of all, there's one original race. Acts 17:26, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. Second, that single race fell into sin, proliferating the curse in diverse ways and at diverse rates. Remember Genesis 11, at Babel, the Lord confused the language of all the earth. So again, not just the curse over here. And by the way, we have no problem talking about structural injustice. We talk about structural racism and things like that. Well, that makes sense. If man is a sinner and they get together, there's going to be sinful artifacts and sinful structures. And what we would say is, why would that be? Well, it would be outside of Christian influence and Christianity. And so what's really happening as we get to race and sex, as we get to those two things, what's really happening here is that Christianity gives us a long march in and out of pagan barbarism, abusive, murderous, bloody, unjust, collectivist, anthill barbarism. And Christianity alone cuts in there. Wow, why didn't God cut this one out all at once? Or cut this one out all at once? Why didn't he do that? Why didn't he do it? Well, why don't you do it? You haven't done anything. And Christianity alone gives you the tools and the intellectual framework and the virtues and the moral presuppositions that are necessary, which is why in the Christian West you do see those very things. But what's happening here is that slavery and some of these other things are assumed in Scripture, and then the effects of the gospel root it out. And so, yes, and we can talk about inequality and God's providence in there throughout history, but not so much in ethics class, so we don't need to get into that right away. But in the New Testament, you see the severing, not the burning of the outer branches of slavery and these things, but a severing at the root, which then a dead tree will fall in time. Only Christianity does that. Everywhere else we see slavery practiced, justified, and of course the argument's always in the modern world to bring it back, but in a different form of collectivism. But in the Bible we see the opposite. Acts 10:34, God shows no partiality, but in every nation, everyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. Acts 10:15, what God has made clean, do not call common. He wasn't just talking about food. The food was the sign. He was talking about people. Paul in Galatians 3:28, there's neither Jew nor Greek, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. That's why in the first couple centuries, when slaves would be drinking of the same cup in communion as their masters, and in baptism being baptized in the same water as people who were free, by the way, in the Roman Empire in the first century, 2/3 of the population were slaves. And we don't realize that, and we take all this for granted. 1 John 4:20, if anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. For he who does not love his brother who he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And there's other passages that talk about this. You see in the Old Testament that the slave trading was for kidnapping and selling, that whole profiteering. That was the death penalty for that. In Exodus 21, it's repeated in 1 Timothy 1:10. You see a whole system of the slaves being able to obtain their freedom, the Jubilee year. I can give you chapter and verse, all those different things. And then Paul put his money where his mouth was in his gospel when he was writing to Philemon in that letter, where the master is urged to be reconciled to the slave Onesimus. In verse 16, and no longer as a bondservant, but more than a bondservant, but as a beloved brother. Paul commends seeking one's liberty to the Corinthians. If you have the ability to avail yourself of freedom, 1 Corinthians 7:23. So again, when you see the house codes, the Roman house codes, Ephesians 6, Colossians 3, 1 Timothy 6:1, what's happening is that Paul is instructing masters and slaves. He doesn't sever at the root of the institution. For Paul or for Jesus to appeal to Caesar for the whole institution makes no sense in that context because they had no political power. But why didn't God just do that? He could have. He could have done any number of things. You could say that with any evil. Okay, and so this is no more problematic than the other ones. And this is the way that the gospel is marching forward here. And so in the New Testament, you see God, through Paul, caring for real people, not loving humanity by just ignoring the real people in their real slave circumstances, because we can see the wisdom of it. I mean, some of those commandments to slaves in those letters actually apply to workers, to employers today. Well, anyway, you have objection for the Bible is misogynistic and homophobic. Again, different order than over here. But nature is what's going to count, both in the New Testament texts on men and women and in the New Testament texts on homosexuality. You will notice that there's an appeal to natural law. For women in 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Timothy 2, an appeal to natural law. Same thing happening with homosexuality. You see that in Romans 1:23 and you see it in Jude 7. Contrary to nature. It's simply not true as, well, again, it's not an ethics class, but the New Testament carries that forward just as in the Old Testament. So what is happening here, long story short, because we do have to keep this one short, is that great statement by C.S. Lewis, I think really, really applies here in a different way. He said, Christianity, if false, is of no importance, but if true, of ultimate importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. You see what's happening here? The red pen's being broken out by people that don't believe in the presuppositions that allow them to make moral judgments to begin with. If Christianity is true, if God is God and He created the world and He created men and women with natures and all these different things, all of these objections completely dissolve. Now, this is the easiest of these categories. Next time we'll talk about textual variants. Actually, next time we'll talk about scientific primitivism, then textual variants. Then we'll get to 2 sessions on what are normally classified as contradictions.